with all of that, let's now take this to how do you deal with stakeholders when things are going horribly wrong? What are the best practices in crisis communication that derive from all of this? And it goes back to, if you're going to move people, you need to meet them where they are. And in a crisis, it's relatively easy to figure out what your stakeholders care about. So when we think about audiences in a crisis, there's one central defining question that we need to ask, and that is, what are the legitimate expectations of our stakeholders? That if we begin with what are the legitimate expectations of those who matter to us, our customers, our employees, our investors, regulators, business partners, what are the legitimate expectations? Another way to ask the same question is this. There are really three parts to the question. Part number one, what would reasonable people appropriately expect? We can debate what a reasonable person is. What would reasonable people appropriately expect a responsible organization or leader to do when faced with this kind of situation? Whatever the crisis is, what would reasonable people appropriately expect a responsible company to do when faced with this particular situation? And the answer to that question isn't very hard. But I find that if we ask a different question, we get a completely different result. If we ask the question, what should we as a company do in this moment? We begin to consider the question from the point of view of the company, not from the point of view of our stakeholders. And we bring to the discussion all of our own internal barriers to making good decisions. We bring our own prejudices, our own political boundaries, we bring our own way of understanding ourselves, we become very self-protective. But if we ask the question, what would our stakeholders appropriately expect a responsible company to do? We eliminate those barriers and we can actually make good decisions faster than would otherwise be the case. So I advise my clients and I teach my students, in every instance, this is the first question we ought to ask after we figured out what the situation is. If it's, when presented with this kind of situation, well, what is the situation? Once we understand the situation, or once we think we understand at least the scope of the situation, well, what would our stakeholders appropriately expect a responsible company to do when faced with that? And that's usually the starting point for a pretty good solution. Having said that, when we look at the reasonable expectations of stakeholders, the single biggest predictor of reputational harm, of loss of trust, of loss of confidence, of loss of competitive advantage, the single biggest predictor that the company is not handling the crisis well is the perception among stakeholders that the company doesn't care. Because reasonable people appropriately expect a responsible company to care. The starting point is show you care. The single biggest predictor is that you don't care. And because humans want to connect with each other, they want the company to care. And when you don't care, that causes dissonance, and that causes them to back away and say, there's something wrong with you. You're not doing what we need you to do. There's something wrong with you.